In the spring of 2007, a man named Dale Kurtz stood on the loading dock of his stone flour mill in Colfax County, Nebraska, and was told, in polite but precise terms, that what he was doing with his father's operation was a hobby. The company representative, a grain procurement director named Brent Haas, had driven out from Omaha in a clean white pickup with his employer's name stenciled on the door. He wore a pressed Oxford shirt and carried a folder of market projections printed on company letterhead. His boots were clean. They had never touched the mill floor. Haas set the folder on the dock railing and explained, with the patient fluency of a man who has explained things to farmers before, that the artisan flour segment was not growing at a rate that justified Dale's cost structure. The volume numbers were not there. The distribution infrastructure was not there. He said that the premium flour customer, in his experience, was a fickle buyer, and fickle buyers did not support the kind of long-term capital investment the mill would need to stay competitive. He paused. He smiled. "What you've got out here, Mr. Kurtz, is a boutique operation," Haas said. "There's no volume pathway. There's no scale. I'd hate to see you spend the next decade running something the market simply isn't going to reward." That meeting happened on a Thursday morning in April. The stones were running inside. You could feel the low vibration through the dock planking if you stood still. Dale said two things and then stopped talking. He said he didn't need a volume pathway. He said the mill had been running since 1951, and he intended it to run a good while longer. Haas closed the folder. He said he understood, and he meant it kindly, and he shook Dale's hand, and he drove back to Omaha. 14 years later, in the autumn of 2021, Brent Haas drove back out to Colfax County, only this time in his personal car without the folder. And this time, he was not the one talking. That turnaround is the story. To understand it, you have to go back further than 2007. You have to go back to the stone and to what the stone does that nothing in Haas's folder had ever been designed to measure. Let me tell you about Dale Kurtz. He was 54 years old in 2007, lean and weathered, the kind of lean that comes from decades of flour dust and lifting and early mornings, not from any effort at it. He had worked the mill since he was 16, alongside his father, Rowan, who had bought the stone milling equipment at an estate auction in 1951 and spent the better part of 2 years learning to dress the stones himself, because there was no one left in Colfax County who would do it for reasonable money. Rowan had located a retired mill operator in central Kansas through a letter-writing campaign that took him 8 months, and that man, a widower named Hollis, had driven up twice to teach what he knew before his health stopped permitting the drive. Rowan had written everything down in a black observation notebook, the measurements and the angles and the sequence of cuts in the furrow pattern, and he had kept notes on every batch the stones produced for the first 3 years until he trusted what he heard. Dale had grown up with that notebook on the kitchen shelf. He had read it so many times that he no longer needed to. He knew every gear in the main drivetrain by sound. He could hear a misalignment in the stone gap from 50 feet away on a quiet morning. He was known in Colfax County for 2 things: a quietness that most people mistook for stubbornness, and a flour that most people could not describe precisely, but kept coming back to buy. The mill sat on 62 acres of bottom ground along the Loup River, 3 miles outside the town of Genoa. The stone burrs were French burrstone, each pair weighing just over a ton, and they had been in continuous use for most of those 56 years since Rowan had set them. The building was a 2-story frame structure with a corrugated metal roof, patched in 4 different colors, and a loading dock that sagged on the east end. A hand-lettered sign on the main door said, Kurtz Mill, established 1951, and it was the only signage on the property. From the road, the place looked like it was losing. It had always looked that way from the road. What the road didn't show was the wheat. Dale sourced from 12 farms within 20 miles, all of them growing older, hard red winter varieties that the commodity elevators refused at standard prices because the protein content was inconsistent, lot to lot. Inconsistent to the elevator meant unfit for blending at scale. To Dale, it meant variable in the richest possible direction, different in a way that the stones could work with rather than around. He paid a small premium above commodity price for those varieties. Not enough to make any farm dependent on him alone, but enough to keep the relationship alive and the acreage planted. He did not sign contracts. He shook hands and wrote a line in his own notebook and showed up each October. The relationships went back to Rowan in most cases. A few went back further. If you haven't thought about what stone milling does differently, let me explain it, because it is the engine of everything that happened after. Modern roller mills separate the wheat berry into its three components, the bran, the germ, and the endosperm, before grinding, so the heat-sensitive germ oil can be removed. The germ oil goes rancid fast, and rancid flour does not ship well, does not store well, and does not sit on a retail shelf for 6 months without problems. So the germ comes out. With the germ goes most of the fat-soluble vitamins, most of the flavor compounds, and a measurable portion of the proteins that affect how a dough handles. The resulting white flour is shelf-stable, consistent, and light. It is also nutritionally thin and, in the view of certain bakers, texturally flat. Stone milling does not separate first. The whole berry passes between the stones, bran, germ, and endosperm together, at a gap Dale controlled within fractions of a millimeter by listening to the stones. The friction is lower and more even than roller milling because the stones float slightly, riding on the grain itself. The germ oils are incorporated rather than removed. A true stone-milled whole wheat flour retains the germ intact, which means a shorter shelf life and a richer, more complex flavor profile, and a protein matrix in the dough that behaves differently from roller-milled wheat, absorbing water more slowly and holding it longer. Bakers who understood this produced bread with a chew and a crumb structure that roller-milled flour simply could not replicate. Dale did not invent any of this. Rowan had understood it. The distinction was as old as the Industrial Revolution. What Dale had done was hold the line through every decade when the financial logic said to quit. By 2007, he was selling flour to 11 bakeries, 4 restaurants, 3 specialty grocery stores in Omaha and Lincoln, and a direct retail customer base of about 230 households who drove out or ordered by mail. His annual volume was about 42,000 pounds. Haas's company moved 42,000 pounds in a single hour at peak production. That was the math that produced the smile on Haas's face. Dale's neighbor to the north, a man named Gus Fikema, had taken a different path. Gus was 48 in 2007, a third-generation grain farmer with good land and a confident relationship with the commodity system. He had expanded aggressively in the early 2000s when land prices were favorable, financing 200 additional acres at variable rates, and had installed precision planting equipment, a grain monitoring system, and a dedicated agronomist on retainer. Gus's yields per acre were measured and proven. His margins, he explained to Dale at a fall harvest dinner in 2007, were thin but consistent. "You know where you stand," Gus said. "The system tells you." Dale listened to that and nodded. He went home and dressed the stones. Dale's daughter, Maren, had come back to Genoa in the fall of 2008 after 4 years at the University of Nebraska, studying food systems and a year working for a regional restaurant group in Lincoln handling supplier relationships and procurement. She was 27. She had grown up in flour dust and had left it with some relief, and she returned with a complicated feeling that she would not fully resolve for several more years. She respected what her father did. She had written a paper in her junior year about heritage grain operations in the Great Plains and had used the Kurtz Mill as a case study, and the professor who graded it had asked if she knew the operator personally. She said yes. He said, "That's an unusual operation. I didn't know there were still mills doing this." She had gone back to her apartment and stared at the ceiling for a while. She was not certain the operation could last. That was the honest position she held in October 2008, standing in the mill yard with flour dust settling on her jacket sleeves. Maren's stated position that fall, over a kitchen table dinner with Dale and her mother Edith, was that the operation needed to modernize its outreach and consider building out its customer relationships more deliberately, even if the production methods stayed the same. The website was a text file on a university server from 2003. The mailing list was a paper ledger. She said the words customer relationships out loud and watched her father's expression, which did not change. He said scaling wasn't the point. She said she understood that, but the bills were not getting smaller and the customer list was not growing on its own. He got up from the table and came back with the ledger, the actual ledger, the cloth-bound accounts book that went back to 1974, when Rowan had handed it to him. He set it in front of her without a word. She read it for 20 minutes. The operation was carrying no debt. The property was paid off. The equipment maintenance costs were high relative to volume, but the maintenance was itemized clearly, each repair noted with date and dollar amount. Dale was paying himself $61,000 a year and had been for 8 years. The direct retail customers were paying their invoices within 30 days on average. The bakery accounts were slower but consistent. It was not comfortable. It was not precarious either. Maren closed the ledger and slid it back across the table. She did not say anything about scaling after that conversation. She stayed to help with the customer-facing side of the operation, handling correspondence and the new website she built and launched in January of 2009. She photographed the stones, the loading dock, the river bottom in morning light. She wrote descriptions of the milling process that she had to ask Dale to check for accuracy. He corrected 2 details about the stone temperature and read the rest without comment, which she had learned to take as approval. She did not touch the milling itself. That was still his. In March of 2009, a chef named Petra Novak drove out from Lincoln. She ran a small restaurant on O Street that had developed a reputation for its bread. She had been using Dale's flour for 8 months, bought through the specialty grocer. She walked through the mill without speaking, looking at the stones, at the stone dressing chisels hanging on the wall, at the wheat in the hopper. Then she stood at the loading dock and looked at the 62 acres along the river bottom for a while. She asked one question. "How long can you keep this going?" Dale said. "As long as the stones hold." She went back to Lincoln and sent him a letter the following week, saying she was moving all her flour purchasing to the Kurtz Mill and asking whether he could guarantee her a steady supply at her current volume, which was about 400 pounds a month. He wrote back by hand that he could. He did not raise the price. She had not asked him to lower it. The quiet CTA aside is simply this. If you have ever bought bread from someone who still mills this way, you already know what was at stake in those 14 years. We will get to the number. It takes a while to earn. Through 2010 and 2011, Marin began tracking the customer base more systematically. The household list had grown to 418. The bakery accounts had grown to 17. A food systems researcher at the University of Nebraska had cited Dale's mill in two papers about heritage grain retention and stone milling economics. Dale had not known about the papers until Marin showed them to him. He read them carefully and said, "They got the stone temperature wrong." Marin posted the papers on the website. The household list grew to 540 by the end of 2011. That same year, Gus Fikema refinanced. The variable rate on his expansion debt had reset twice, and the per-bushel prices he had expected when he expanded had softened. He took a fixed-rate note on his existing debt and signed a forward contract on the following year's crop to stabilize. His agronomist said the numbers looked workable. The numbers looked workable because the system was working. The system would keep working as long as input costs stayed in their band and commodity prices stayed in theirs. Dale bought new millstones. He had budgeted for them for 3 years, setting aside a fixed amount each month in a separate account he did not touch. When the account reached $12,000, he began calling around. The French burstone supply chain was thin. The quarry at La Ferté-sous-Jouarre had been operating at reduced capacity for years, and the American importers who still stocked the material were down to 2. He located a set of blanks through a mill restoration company in Ohio and contracted with them for delivery the following spring. Before the stones arrived, he drove to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, to find a man named Carl Erb, who was 72 years old and was, by general agreement of the mill restoration community, one of the last working stone dressers in the eastern half of the country. Carl had learned the craft from his father, who had dressed stones for commercial mills in Pennsylvania and Maryland through the 1950s and 1960s. Carl's customers now came from 7 states and included 2 university agricultural stations that ran heritage grain programs. He was not famous. He was findable if you knew to look. Dale spent 2 days at Carl's shop. Carl demonstrated the furrow pattern on a scrap stone and let Dale work alongside him with a chisel, correcting his angle twice and his pressure once. "The furrow is not just a channel," Carl said. "It's a trajectory. You're directing the particle through the grinding zone. Get the angle wrong and you grind twice where you should grind once, and you heat the germ." He showed Dale a set of measurements Rowan had not used and explained the reasoning in practical terms, with reference to the grain's behavior and the stone's rotation, not to any textbook. Dale wrote it all in Rowan's notebook. He wrote in the margins when the space on the page was used up, and at the end of the second day he had 4 new pages of notes in his own hand beneath Rowan's original entries. Carl looked at the notebook before Dale closed it and said, "Your father kept a good record." Dale said he was a thorough man. He drove home, had the new stones bedded, and ran a test batch the following week. The flour came off finer than any batch he had run in 5 years. He ran it again and got the same result. He said nothing about this to Marin. She noticed it in the texture of the sample she packed for a bakery order and asked what had changed. He said, "Carl Erb." She said, "Who's that?" He said, "Pennsylvania man." She let it go. In 2013, Brent Haas stopped at the mill without calling. He was passing through on personal travel and pulled the company pickup off the county road on an impulse he probably did not examine closely. He stood at the edge of the dock and watched Dale for a few minutes. The stones were running. The sound was different from 6 years earlier, higher and more even, and Haas had no way to know why. He said, "You're still here." Dale said, "I am." Haas looked at the operation. The new stones were bedded in the main housing, visibly larger than the pair he had seen in 2007. The customer list Marin had printed and framed now ran to 2 pages and was tacked to the office wall where you could read it from the dock. He glanced at it and looked away. He said, "The artisan grain market has more legs than I projected." Dale handed him a 5-pound bag of flour from the current run without saying anything. Haas took it. He looked at the bag for a moment. Then he looked back at the stones. He said, "I'll be in touch." He drove back to the county road and turned south toward the highway. Marin had watched from the window. She asked Dale what Haas had said when she came out. Dale told her. She asked if Dale thought he would be in touch. He said he didn't know. He went back to the stones. The first material signal of what was coming arrived in the summer of 2012 and sharpened considerably through 2013 and into 2014. A wheat streak mosaic virus had established itself in the Central Platte River Valley, moving through the most widely planted commercial varieties with consistent efficiency. The uniform commercial seed stock, planted across contiguous fields by growers following the same agronomic model, offered essentially no genetic buffer. The virus required green tissue, and the densely planted monoculture fields provided it continuously. Dale's 12 source farms grew varieties that Rowan had identified in the 1950s and 1960s as regionally adapted. Most of them were no longer in commercial production. They had been maintained by the farms themselves, year after year, through saved seed. Because they were not the same variety, their resistance profiles were not identical. Some were more susceptible than others, but there was no field in Dale's supply network that planted the same variety as the one adjacent to it. The virus moved differently through a mosaic. Some fields showed damage. None were wiped. The uniform commercial fields lost between 22 and 38% of their expected yield in 2013. The county average yield for hard red winter wheat in Colfax County fell by 27% from the prior 5-year average. Gus Vaikema's fields, all planted in the same certified variety as agronomists had specified, lost 31%. On his expanded acreage, financed at a fixed rate with a forward contract, locked in at a price set before the losses were known, 31% was not a manageable number. It was a crisis. Dale's 12 farms averaged a 9% yield reduction across their combined acreage. Not painless, not a disaster either. Dale did not say anything about this to Gus. He brought over a case of beer in October 2013 and sat on Gus's porch and listened. Gus talked for 2 hours. The forward contract had protected him on the downside, but also capped his recovery. He was going to finish the year underwater by somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000, depending on how the final tally came out. He had talked to the bank. The bank was not enthusiastic. Marin had been watching the county numbers. In January of 2014, she sat down with Dale and said she thought they needed to expand their source farm relationships, gently, while there was appetite for it. Not to increase volume dramatically, to deepen the network, because the 9 farms whose yields had held were the ones with the most variety diversity, and they were going to remember that. Dale agreed. He spent the spring of 2014 visiting 8 additional farms in the county, all of them growing varieties he recognized from Rowan's notes. He did not pitch them anything elaborate. He told them what he was doing and what he paid and why the variety mattered. 6 of them agreed to sell to him the following harvest. His source network went from 12 farms to 18. In the late summer of 2014, a wheat stem rust strain that had appeared in East Africa in the late 1990s began showing up in Kansas and Nebraska. It was the same strain that had devastated global wheat crops in the early 20th century. before being bred out of existence through the Green Revolution's resistant varieties. The resistant varieties had held for decades. The new strain had evolved around them. The 2014 season was not catastrophic, but it was a warning of something the uniform commercial varieties could not absorb without damage, because the resistant genes in those varieties had been selected for one profile, and the new strain was a different profile. Dale's 18 farms grew varieties selected in conditions that preceded the Green Revolution's uniformity program. Several of them had partial resistance profiles the newer strains hadn't encountered. By 2015, the Nebraska Extension Service had sent a plant pathologist named Marcus Webb out to 5 farms in the region to sample wheat for stem rust response. 2 of the 5 farms he sampled were in Dale's network. Webb found partial resistance in one variety that he had not encountered in commercial germ plasm. He took samples back to Lincoln. The Extension Service published a preliminary note in the spring of 2016. Dale read it and said nothing. Marin posted it on the website. The household list grew by 60 names that spring. And here is where you have to understand what happens when an institution notices something it had dismissed. Webb came out to the mill in June of 2016. He was a careful man, methodical, with the slightly apologetic manner of a scientist who knows he is about to ask a farmer to spend an afternoon with him. He brought a clipboard and a camera and a cooler for the samples, and he had read Marin's website thoroughly enough that he already knew the farm count and the general region of sourcing before he arrived. Dale drove him to 4 of the source farms that afternoon, the ones whose variety lineage was clearest and whose seed records went back the furthest, without commercial interruption. At each farm, Webb collected grain from the current stored crop and asked questions about seed sources going back 10 and 20 years. 2 of the farmers produced their own notebooks. One of them had records going back to 1958. When they returned to the mill, Webb asked to see Rowan's notebook. Dale set it on the dock railing and let him look. Webb turned pages slowly. He stopped twice to ask questions about specific variety names and farm notations. He asked if the sourcing relationships had been continuous since the dates noted. Dale said yes, with 2 exceptions he could name. Webb noted those exceptions in his clipboard record. Then he looked up and said, "This is the most complete variety provenance record in the county." He paused. He said, "Maybe in the region." Dale said, "Rowan was a thorough man." Webb asked if he could photograph the pages. Dale said yes. Webb spent 40 minutes photographing the notebook in sections, using the daylight from the dock rather than a flash. When he was done, he closed his own notes, capped his pen, and stood looking at the river bottom for a moment. He said, "I want to be careful about what I tell you until the lab results come back. But I think you have something here that is not common and is not replaceable if it is lost." Dale said, "I know." Webb drove back to Lincoln with his cooler full of samples. His full report came out in September of 2016. It named 6 heritage varieties represented in Dale's supply network as candidates for formal germ plasm preservation. It recommended that the university's agricultural station establish a seed bank of those varieties and coordinate with the source farms to maintain viable populations across multiple sites. It noted that 3 of the 6 showed partial resistance to the new rust strain at levels not found in any current commercial germ plasm collection, and that 1 variety showed a protein structure that produced measurably different dough development characteristics under controlled baking conditions, specifically a higher water absorption rate and a longer gluten network development time, consistent with what specialty bakers had been reporting anecdotally about stone-milled heritage flour for years. Maren read the report 3 times. She printed it and set it on the kitchen table and sat down with Dale that evening. She asked him how he felt about it. He said, "Good, I suppose." She asked if it changed anything. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Rowan knew this." He said it slower than usual, the way he said things when he meant them carefully. Rowan knew this in 1953. In the spring of 2019, a regional bakery brand based in Kansas City began researching stone-milled flour sourcing for a new product line. They were a mid-tier brand, roughly $40 million in annual revenue, trying to move upmarket with an artisan positioning. Their head of product development, a woman named Sandra Yee, had read the web report. She had also been given the Kurtz Mill website by a chef in Lincoln who had described the flour as unlike anything available at commercial scale. Sandra called the mill in April of 2019. Maren answered. Sandra asked about volume availability and unit pricing and turnaround logistics. Maren told her the annual production was 96,000 pounds, about half committed to existing accounts, and that they did not hold inventory for more than 3 weeks. Sandra asked if there was a path to expanding production. Maren said she would ask. Dale listened to the summary of that conversation and said, "What kind of company are they?" Maren described them. He asked if they would want to use their own branding on the flour. Maren said probably yes, that was the nature of ingredient sourcing. Dale said, "Then they need to come out here." Sandra Yee drove up from Kansas City in May of 2019. She walked the operation for 2.5 hours. She tasted flour from the current run with a small amount of water, which is a baker's test, not a food scientist's test, and she was quiet for a long time afterward. Then she asked Dale what the limitation was on production. He said, "The stones. 1 pair of stones can produce a certain amount per week without heating past the threshold that begins to damage the germ." He said, "I will not run them faster." She asked what the threshold was. He explained it in technical terms. The stones needed to maintain a surface temperature below roughly 90 degrees Fahrenheit, because above that the germ oils began to oxidize. He monitored the stone temperature with his hand. He had done it this way for 35 years. She asked if a second pair of stones was possible. He said, "If you want to pay for them, I'll bed them." Sandra went back to Kansas City. Maren waited 2 weeks and then called. Sandra said the company was interested in a supply agreement, but needed to discuss scale with their board. Maren said they were not going to hold space waiting. Sandra said she understood. In the summer of 2020, 2 things happened. The company came back with a formal proposal, and a large regional grain company made a buyout offer for the mill property and operation. The buyout was substantial. $1.4 million for the 62 acres, the equipment, the customer relationships, and the Kurtz brand name. The buyer's intention, which he stated plainly, was to convert the operation to a contract milling arrangement at higher volume using the stone mill name as a marketing identifier while modifying the process to increase the throughput. Dale read the offer for a long time. Then he asked Maren what she thought. She said she thought the stones couldn't be modified the way the buyer intended without breaking the product. She said the customer base had been built on something real, not on a name. She said the farms in their network had maintained their varieties partly because of their relationship with the mill. She said she didn't know what would happen to those variety lines if the supply relationship dissolved. Dale said, "I know what would happen." He sent a letter declining the offer. 2 weeks later, he signed a supply agreement with the Kansas City company for 22,000 pounds per year, contingent on the company financing a second pair of French burstone sourced through a European importer Marin had located. The agreement specified that the milling protocol was not subject to modification, that the stone temperature threshold was a contractual requirement, and that the company's product labeling would identify the mill by name and location. It was the largest single supply contract the mill had signed. It was also written so that Dale could cancel it if the company ever asked him to change the stones. The second set of stones was bedded in January of 2021. Dale trained Marin on stone dressing over the winter. She already knew most of it, the basic sequence, the tools, the way to read the land pattern on a used stone by rubbing a thin coat of red marking compound across its face, and setting the upper stone down briefly so the high spots printed in red. She had watched the process for years without being formally instructed. But there was a sequence of cuts in the furrow pattern that he had never walked her through explicitly. The refinements from Carl in Pennsylvania that he had added to Rowan's notebook 8 years earlier. He showed her each cut in order, using a spare chisel on a scrap stone, and explained what it did to the particle's path through the grinding zone and why the angle mattered. She worked beside him for 2 full weekends on the new pair, making the cuts herself while he watched. He stopped her twice, both times for the same reason: pressure on the third pass. She corrected it. She asked him why he hadn't shown her this before. He said, "You weren't ready to see it yet." She asked how he knew she was ready now. He said she had been reading the stones by sound for 2 seasons, without knowing she was doing it. He said she had adjusted the stone gap 3 times in the fall without asking him and had been right each time. He said the stones told you things if you stayed close enough long enough to hear them. She had been staying close. In September of 2021, the Kansas City company's artisan flour line launched in retail. Their first delivery from the Kurtz mill under the new agreement had been in March. By September, the product had sold through at 4 of their 8 pilot retail accounts and been reordered twice. The product manager sent a note saying the sell-through rate on the stone-milled line was 40% above their projected sell-through for a premium SKU in the first 6 months. 40%. That figure did not land as a quiet number. It landed the way things land when they have been traveling a long distance and finally arrive. Marin read it at the kitchen table under the lamp and showed it to Dale, who was reading Rowan's notebook. He looked at it. He said, "That's a good number." It was the quietest thing he had said in years, and it carried more weight than a speech would have. In October of 2021, Brent Haas drove out from Omaha in his personal car. He called ahead this time. He and Dale stood on the loading dock for an hour. The second pair of stones was running. Haas listened to them. Then he said something that cost him more than Dale could calculate from the outside. He said, "I got the wrong read on what you had out here." Dale said he appreciated that. Haas asked if he could watch the dressing process when they were next due. Dale said, "Come on a Thursday." Haas said he would. That Thursday, Haas watched Marin dress the stones for 40 minutes, moving the chisels in the furrow pattern Carl had shown Dale in Pennsylvania, and Dale had shown Marin in the winter. Haas did not ask many questions. He asked one. He said, "Where did she learn to do that?" Dale said, "From me. And before me, from her grandfather." Haas nodded and watched her finish the cut. Then he said, "You were right not to sell." The methods spread the way methods spread when they have been waiting for the ground to be ready. Webb's seed bank was established at the University Station in 2018, preserving all 6 varieties. 2 of Dale's source farms began selling saved seed directly to other small operations by 2020, a commercial side they had not had before. By 2022, two younger farmers in the county, both of them under 35, had approached Dale about starting their own stone milling operations, not to compete with him, but because they had read the extension report and come to understand that there were other pockets of the variety mosaic in their own county that had never been collected. Dale spent 3 Saturdays with them in 2022, walking their ground, looking at their wheat varieties, answering questions about sourcing and stone maintenance. He charged nothing for this. He gave them Rowan's notebook and had Marin photograph every page so he could keep the copies and give them the original photographs and keep the original for the mill. He gave one of the young farmers, a man named Theo, a copy of Carl's instruction on the furrow cuts, handwritten in Dale's own hand with a note at the top that said, "These came from Carl Erb of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Carl got them from his father. His father got them from another man before that. Ask who you got them from when you pass them on." Gus Fikema had recovered by 2018, slowly, through a combination of debt restructuring and 3 good yield years. He had not planted diversified varieties. His agronomist did not recommend it. His system was still built for one kind of certainty. Gus came to the mill in the fall of 2022. He had never come before, in all the years they had been neighbors. He stood at the loading dock and looked at the 2 pairs of stones running. He said, "I've been thinking about the 2013 season." Dale waited. Gus said, "I've been wondering if there was something different I could have done with the seed." Dale said, "Probably." He said it without edge. Gus asked if there was a way to find out. Dale said, "Theo might know. He's been talking to Webb." That conversation between Gus and Theo did not happen quickly. It took 2 years. In 2024, Gus planted 40 acres of a heritage variety that Theo had sourced from the university's seed bank. He was not converting his operation. He was watching. That is how these things move, not all at once, but one watching season at a time. There is a thing that happens in communities when a long-held position is finally proven. Not loudly, not with celebration, but through the arithmetic. The question is not whether the number arrives. The question is whether the knowledge can outlast the interval between the dismissal and the proof. Dale understood, without ever having said it aloud, that the interval is the whole of the work. The stones ran through 2007 because they had run through 2003 and 1998 and 1991. The supply network held in 2013 because the relationships had been built in 1994 and 1982 and 1966, when Rowan was still alive and still shaking hands on the loading dock. The second set of stones in 2021 was possible because of a stone dresser in Pennsylvania who had kept the craft alive because his father had, and because Dale had listened to him for 2 days in 2012 and written it down and taught it to Marin when she was ready to learn. The mill does not belong to any decade. That is the nature of what it holds. There are 2 kinds of knowing in that story, and they are not equal, and events eventually say so. One kind is calibrated to what a spreadsheet can hold, which is volume and margin and throughput, and the efficiency of a system that moves on to the next quarter without looking back. The other kind is calibrated to a particular piece of ground, a particular stone, a particular wheat berry, and the long memory of what that combination has done across 70 years of seasons that the spreadsheet never measured and could not predict. The first kind makes confident projections. The second kind dresses the stones on Thursdays and waits. Haas's projection was not wrong in the terms of the system that produced it. In 2007, Stone milling at 42,000 pounds per year was not a volume pathway, not by any reasonable measurement of the commodity market. What the projection could not account for was the 14 years between the assessment and the outcome, and what accumulates in a stone mill across 14 years when the work is done every day, regardless of whether anyone is watching. Rowan's notebook is on the kitchen shelf under the lamp. The furrow cuts are written out in 3 different hands now. Rowan's and Dale's, and the copy Dale made for Theo, and another he is making for Marin's set. The 6th copy will be started when Theo teaches someone. The notebook does not know it is a library. It simply holds what was learned. The stones know what they are. They have always known. That is enough.